January 1991, India's foreign reserves were a meager $1.2 billion.
Our foreign exchange reserves when I took over were no more than $1 billion, that is roughly equal to 2 weeks' imports.
By June, the reserves were half. In the next 2 to 3 weeks, India would have $0 and no money to import essential goods.
But we are on the verge of a collapse.
The International Monetary Fund (IMF) suspended its loan program for India, and the World Bank also discontinued its assistance. The government was unable to pass the budget because Moody downgraded India's bond ratings. The current account deficit, that is the money a nation sends abroad in excess of what it receives, was $8.9 billion, or 3.5% of GDP. The fiscal deficit, which is the amount a nation spends in excess of its income, was 9.2% of GDP.
They insisted on devaluation of the standard IMF prescription. We devalued our currency.
In just 3 days, between July 1 and 3, 1991, the rupee, Indian currency, was devalued by 19.5%. Inflation rose to 13.7%. Everything that could go wrong with India's economy has gone wrong, and many observers believe that India would become a failed state. But India didn't fall. Instead, India would use their near-death experience to revive its economy, which is today the 5th largest economy in the world.
As China's economic growth slows, people are looking for the next big driver of growth, and India seems to fit the bill.
India's economy defeated expectations.
Explosive growth.
The economy grew at 7.2%,
7.5%,
7.7%,
7.8%,
9.5%,
10% or more,
11.5%,
18%.
Rise on the upside.
Strong.
strong, rising.
Superpower, unstoppable, fastest growing economy in the world.
Overtake China.
In a short span of 10 years,
dethroning the US, biggest economies by 2075.
India's GDP could double in the next 7 years.
We'll come back to how India did that shortly as we try to compare India's economy with that of Africa and point out a few reasons why Africa hasn't seen as much growth as India in recent years. And yes, we all know that Africa is not a country, but just as bananas have a lot in common with plantains, India has a lot in common with Africa. Africa and India both experienced brutal invasion and colonization from the European powers. Both have similar population sizes and similar demography, and they are both synonymous with poverty for many decades. Having said that, let's look at factors that have affected the economy of both India and Africa since their independence and try to understand why India seems to be growing faster in recent years. On August 24, 1608, the British landed for the first time in Surat, India. Like a thief who came to spy on you before stealing your belongings, the British went to India as traders, seeking to establish trade relations with the Mughal Empire, which was then the dominant power in India. The East India Company, a British trading company, then established factories or trading posts, and these factories gradually became the foundation of British rule in India. The British gradually increased their footprint, and by 1858, the British government directly ruled India, which became known as the British Raj. Like India, the first European colonization of an African country was the Portuguese conquest of Ceuta in 1415. Ceuta is a coastal town in North Africa that was strategically important for controlling trade routes in the Mediterranean Sea. By 1884, the scramble for Africa had begun as every European power was involved in taking the loot of Africa. Contrary to what most people believe, that India and Africa are not the same, by the 1940s, leaders from both regions of the world saw themselves as brothers in the struggle for freedom. For example, Mahatma Gandhi and Kwame Nkrumah exchanged letters now and then, sharing their experiences with the struggle for independence. In a letter dated November 17, 1946, Gandhi wrote to Nkrumah, "I have always admired the courage of your people in their fight for freedom. I hope that your country will soon be free from British domination." Jomo Kenyatta, the first president of Kenya, Patrice Lumumba, the first Prime Minister of the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Julius Nyerere, the first President of Tanzania, and many more African leaders of the 1940s and 50s either met with Gandhi, corresponded regularly with him, or saw him as their brother in struggle. And this leads us to a very important point. Because leaders from both India and Africa hated the European powers for the atrocity of colonization, they also hated the Western system of government, capitalism. In his 1909 book, Hind Swaraj, Mahatma Gandhi wrote, "Under capitalism, man becomes a slave to money. The rich become richer and the poor become poorer. This is not right." In his 1965 book, Neocolonialism, The Last Stage of Imperialism, Kwame Nkrumah, who was the most influential African leader of this era, wrote, "Capitalism is a system that is based on exploitation and injustice. It is a system that benefits the rich at the expense of the poor. It is a system that is incompatible with the African dream of freedom and equality." In 1952, the CIA published a report titled The Growing Influence of Communism in Africa. This report detailed how African leaders were having alliances with the Chinese Communist Party and other socialist elements. Nelson Mandela, Julius Nyerere, Ahmed Ben Bella, Patrice Lumumba, and many more African leaders in the 1950s and 60s either had socialist ideology or were friends with the Chinese Communist Party. While friendship with socialist elements helped Africa and India get financial and military assistance to resist their colonizers, it would end up hurting the two regions for decades to come. In one of his 1942 editions of Harijan, a magazine Mahatma Gandhi founded in 1933, he wrote, "The only way to avoid class war is through trusteeship." Even though Mahatma Gandhi hated capitalism, he wasn't a fanatic socialist. Instead, Gandhi believed that something between capitalism and socialism was what the world needed, so he invented an economic system he called trusteeship. Trusteeship, according to Gandhi, means that people should be allowed to own the means of production, but when those people become wealthy, they should look after the welfare of the people in general. In the 1940 edition of Harijan, Gandhi wrote, "The rich man has no right to consume more than he needs while the poor starve."
British Commonwealth of Nations.
Between 1947, when India gained independence, and 1991, when the country was near collapse, the best way to describe India's economic policies is socialist capitalist economy, or call it trusteeship. From the nationalization of key industries, steel, coal, railways between 1947 and 1960, to the industrial licensing system of 1956, to price controls on commodities from the 1950s to 1990, to restrictions on foreign direct investment of 1947, which aimed at imposing severe limits on equity holdings by foreigners, nationalization of banks in 1969, to subsidies of different nature and many more socialist-leaning programs. Many successive Indian leaders created several socialist-leaning programs which cumulatively ended up hurting the country. However, when India was close to collapse in 1991, Prime Minister P.V. Narasimha Rao pressed a brake on many of India's socialist-leaning programs. The previous industrial licensing system was abolished for most industries. Import tariffs were significantly reduced to make Indian goods more competitive in the global market. Foreign direct investment restrictions were relaxed to attract foreign capital, and many sectors of the economy were privatized, among other policies. Now let's talk about Africa. Even though India had a big turnaround in its economic policies in 1991, which has since been recognized as the reason for the country's economic growth, many countries in Africa still have socialist tendencies today. For example, in Nigeria, petroleum products like gas, kerosene, and diesel are being subsidized.
Minister of Finance and Budget and National Planning, Mrs. Zainab Ahmed, says Nigeria spends 18.39 billion naira daily on petrol subsidy.
Electricity, fertilizer, transportation, schools, up to university, food, and many more things are being subsidized by the Nigerian government.
The federal government says it will make provision for subsidy in 2023 to the tune of 6.72 trillion naira.
3.36 trillion has been provided for PMS subsidy,
electricity subsidy,
transport subsidy,
fertilizer subsidy.
Every product, jet fuel, kerosene, diesel, gasoline, everything was being subsidized.
The subsidy cost to the Federation was 243 billion.
Tanzania, Mozambique, Angola, Zimbabwe, Namibia, Benin, Burkina Faso, Ethiopia, Congo, and many more African countries are either socialist states in disguise, or the state controls many sectors of the country, or there are a lot of subsidies and handouts going out for social programs. With the various socialist-leaning programs of many African countries come three major problems. Number one, bureaucracy and corruption. Because the government gets involved in too many sectors of the economy, it ends up with too much power and too many controls, hence an increase in bureaucracy and corruption. Number 2, lack of competition. With government control comes monopoly. With monopoly comes inefficiencies. Innovation is killed and the sector of the economy controlled by the government suffers in the long run. Number 3, disincentives for investments and risk-taking. People take risks to start businesses because they hope to make money. When the government of a country, for example, is distributing a particular product for free or subsidizing it, there's no motivation for anyone to sell or create a better version of such a product. As a result, people don't start businesses, hence deindustrialization. While India's clear departure from socialist-leaning programs led to the deregulation of many sectors of the economy, increased private sector participation, and grew India's economy at an average of 7% over the last 20 years, Africa's economy only grows at an average of 4.5% per year. But Africa has another big problem we have to talk about. While India and Africa seem to be on similar economic levels in the 1960s, the abundance of natural resources in Africa would be a major differentiating factor between the two regions. With the blessing of so many natural resources in Africa comes the curse of those resources. In his 2006 book, The Curse of Riches: Why Nations Fail to Grow with Oil, Jeffrey Sachs wrote, resource-rich countries tend to experience slower economic growth, higher levels of corruption, and more political instability than countries with fewer natural resources. Let's start with political instability.
The Democratic Republic of Congo and Rwanda are once again engaged in dispute.
Fighting in northern Mozambique is worsening a humanitarian crisis.
South Sudan was founded in 2011. But 2 years later, forces allied to the president and vice president began fighting each other.
On the brink of civil war.
Fighting in northern Mozambique.
Renewed fighting.
Real risk of a return to civil war.
Violence has intensified in recent months. Indiscriminate killings.
A power struggle between rival governments triggers fighting on the streets of the capital Tripoli.
From 1960 till date, there were only 4 years that the African continent didn't experience a coup. Of 492 attempted or successful coups carried out around the world since 1950, Africa alone has 220 or 45% of them. Take the Democratic Republic of Congo for example. This is one of the most resource-rich countries in the world, but the country has experienced military coups 5 times since its independence in 1960. The country is one of the most corrupt in the world according to Transparency International. According to the World Bank, nearly 62% of Congolese, around 60 million people, lived on less than $2.15 a day. What's true for the Democratic Republic of the Congo is true for Niger, Equatorial Guinea, Angola, Tanzania, Nigeria, and most African countries. Most countries that suddenly discover huge deposits of natural resources are like teenagers who inherit billions of dollars. Such resources often lead to what the American economist Gordon Tullock called rent-seeking behavior in his 1967 paper, The Rent-Seeking Society. These countries often abandon other sectors of the economy, ignore manufacturing or industrialization, and believe that oil or diamond money will flow forever.
The resource curse is a simple idea. If you get large oil revenues or revenues from any mineral, then theoretically you should be better off. Money can't buy you happiness, but it's a good down payment. But in reality, looking at the reaction of countries to large oil revenues, it has generally been very negative. And what it's done is tend to damage other sections of the economy.
Such countries are also usually corrupt because their natural resources money is centralized and can easily be controlled by a few people.
You find everything in West Africa. And in spite of all of these riches, many of our people cannot afford a meal a day. Many of our people have no access to education. They have no access to housing. They have no access to healthcare. How come that we are so poor in the midst of so much riches?
Coups, civil wars, and dictatorships also tend to be common in countries with lots of natural resources because different groups of people want to control the nation's unimaginable wealth. Because of coups, civil wars, dictatorship, and most importantly, rent-seeking, while India has been working hard to industrialize its economy in the last 3 decades, most African countries are either fighting some wars or enjoying the rent from their natural resources. But there's one more problem for Africa. The Oxford Dictionary defines a nation as a large body of people united by common descent, history, culture, or language inhabiting a particular country or territory. As far as Africa goes, only a few countries can be called a nation. This is because when European colonial rulers took over Africa, for easy administration, they simply combined and administered different tribes under one nation. After decades of this forced marriage, at independence, none of these tribes could be separated again. This then leads to countries being occupied by people who have nothing in common. The result of this is constant, never-ending strife, conflict, and wars. Another big problem with Africa's economy is the fact that within Africa, Africans don't transact business with one another because it's not easy to do so.
We have visa regulations left, right, and center. 27 countries in Europe today, with 430 million people, removed visas. We still have visas. Let me persuade us that it is time we in this continent realize that having visa restrictions amongst ourselves is working against us.
As an African, you are molested sometimes. You're forced to pay bribes. It's so difficult. You have to get visas everywhere, whereas the foreigners can just come in and say, hello, I'm a foreigner. Can I come into your country? They say, yes, you can come in.
Move goods from Nigeria to Benin is not easy. To get a visa to travel is not easy. No free movement of people. No free movement of goods. Too many tariff and non-tariff barriers. I'm aware that since the year 2021, you now have the headquarters of the Africa Continental Free Trade Area. But are we moving goods? Can you move goods easily from Cote d'Ivoire to Ghana? From Liberia to Ghana? From Ghana to Senegal?
The Tomatoes Sellers Association in Ghana gave a very, very, very damning story where transport owners or drivers were moving to Mali and they stopped their vehicle, asked them for some kind of documentation. In the process of producing it, they handcuffed them, or they did not handcuff them. They chained them, put them under
chained them?
Yes.
Wow.
Chaining, like put them in a chain.
Yeah.
Take for example, more than 80% of India's economy is based on transactions within India. Whereas, according to the United Nations, intra-African trade is just 14.4% of total African exports. The reason why African countries don't transact with each other is because if, for example, you manufacture something in Andhra Pradesh, a state in India, and want to sell it in Tamil Nadu, 680 kilometers away, you're still traveling within India. However, if you manufacture something in Monrovia, a city in Liberia, and you want to sell it in Freetown, Sierra Leone, which is just 500 kilometers away, you will have to get a passport, pay export tariffs, import tariffs, customs clearance fees, documentation fees, and many other fees, then go through the headache of changing the currency after you sell your goods. Because of these hurdles, most African manufacturers simply can't afford to sell to their neighboring African countries, and that's why Africans don't do business with each other, which then leads to a decline in economic activities and progress on the continent. Africa is potentially a rich continent, but like India, countries on the continent of Africa and Africa as a continent need drastic changes. Africa needs to rely less on its natural resources and seek ways to industrialize. Africa needs to figure out how to live peacefully with other people who are different from them so as to reduce incessant conflicts and civil wars. African countries need to find ways to reduce corruption, and most importantly, African countries need to figure out how to trade with one another easily. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to like this video and subscribe.